Welcome to the last week of the fall quarter, week 13 for Explore the Bible. Finishing up Mark chapter 16, end of this book. And man, great. I hope you've enjoyed this as we've gone through it. And today we come to a great story, right? I mean, it's like Thanksgiving week in the States. It's Thanksgiving week. Man, what more to give thanks than for the resurrection? So it's a great week to be studying the resurrection. Let's look at Mark chapter 16 in just a minute. Can't do that yet. I need you to subscribe, like, comment, share, ask questions. Appreciate it if you'll do all of that. And then if you want to help support us, go to give.exposedtochrist.com. Okay, here we go. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they could go and anoint him. Very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, they went to the tomb at sunrise. They were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone from the entrance to the tomb for us?" Looking up, they noticed that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. Okay, the Sabbath is Saturday. We're now very early on the first day of the week. Sunrise. Sunday morning, right? Sunday morning. And here these women are coming so that they can go and anoint Jesus. Remember that Jesus dies at 3 p.m. That's what Mark says, chapter 15. Basically around 3 p.m., his body has to be off the cross and in the tomb before sundown, because that's the beginning of the Sabbath. And so there's a rush. They're not able to do everything in the preparation, but the idea is we'll come back after the Sabbath and we'll finish the work of taking care of the body of Jesus. So clearly they thought Jesus was dead, right? Clearly they understood that Jesus had died on the cross. That there's no way that there was any misunderstanding or anything, that he had been buried in this, or buried, we put placed in this tomb because he was dead. So those who want to say, well, Jesus didn't really die or whatever, well, everybody there thought he did. So we're going to have a hard time saying we know better than the people that were the eyewitnesses, right? So as they're going, they're having this conversation. Well, who's going to roll away that stone? There's this big stone there. Who are we going to get to roll that stone away for so that we can do this? And looking up, they noticed that the stone had been rolled away already. Something's up. They get there wondering, they've had this conversation. Then when they get there, the stone is already rolled away. Now this stone is very large. He says large enough to cover an entrance into which people can walk. Now they may bend over to walk in, but it's tall enough that they can walk and carry a body into. Okay, so this stone is kind of a misnomer for us. It is a large boulder that is in front of the tomb that now has been rolled away. And the concept of what has happened here is it's rolled down a little incline, set into place. It's held on the incline by a rock or something under it, chalk to chalk it up, right? But now it has been rolled back up the hill. When they entered the tomb, okay, so the tomb is large enough that they can enter. They saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. I bet they were. There's a young man in a white robe, and he says, "Don't be alarmed." This is what every angel says first, right? Don't be afraid. He told them, "You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified." He was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they put him? You picture that. He points. You see, that's where they put him right there. "But go and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there just as he told you." I love this. Go tell his disciples and Peter. Okay. And there's a lot of theories here that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark, but maybe dictated or informed, maybe is a better word to use there, by Peter. That much of the information comes from Peter for the Gospel of Mark, because Mark obviously was young. He was not at many of these things, and so he gets that. So it's kind of interesting. Tell his disciples and Peter, that almost Peter is, he had the denials and all of that on the last night before Jesus is crucified, and maybe he feels like I'm not a disciple anymore. I'm out of this. But he's pointed out specifically, you go make sure Peter knows, right? That he has risen. He has risen. Man, can you imagine getting this news? And I mean, how your mind has to respond to this, right? Trying to wrap around it. Said they went out and they ran from the tomb. They ran because they were trembling and they were astonished, and it had overwhelmed them, and they said nothing to anyone since they were afraid. You see these words? They were trembling, they were astonished, they were overwhelmed, and they were afraid. They didn't know what to do. This is crazy. This makes no sense, right? This is so far out of anyone's experience ever. They have no clue what to do, and they're completely afraid of what has happened and trying to figure it out and trying to make sense and still go and tell, right? This has to be, I mean, it's like one of the more underwhelming verses to describe what was going on. I mean, they are just, it's hard to imagine what they were feeling. Now, we're going to talk very briefly about this note. Some of the earliest manuscripts conclude with 16:8. We talked very briefly about that last week, right, with the passage where there was a verse left out, where here there's an entire ending to the Gospel of Mark that the scholars will look at who study these things, and I'm not one of those guys, right? I don't study the manuscripts, but I trust the many multiple scholars who have studied the manuscripts, who have that expertise, and what they say is these earlier manuscripts, the ones that date closer to the original writing, do not have this ending that is included here. And in some ways, I think it's not a stretch to say that these verses are included here because they have been included in the King James translation. But since the King James translation, which dominated English language versions for, a couple of over 300 years, dominated English language versions. And so the modern translators did not, as they did in that other where it was one verse, they didn't throw them all out and just not put them. They put them, but they put a little parentheses there, a parenthetical statement that says this is not included in the earlier manuscripts. Now, many of the things that are recorded here in these last several verses are echoed in other Gospels. There's a couple of things that aren't. We're not even going to get to those. So, there's some discussion about whether we ought to, and personally, as a pastor, I would never preach out of these verses that come at the end of Mark. I wouldn't. Just some discussion about whether we ought to teach out of them or not, but we see, the things we're going to look at seem consistent with stuff that we've seen in other gospel records, and so that's why we're going to go ahead and look at it today. But there is real concern and doubt, and I think even a legitimate question to be asked if we were making our first translation ever of the Gospel of Mark into English, would we include these verses in the first translation ever? The first, so that's a legitimate question. But we're going to look at a portion of them anyway. Early on the first day of the week, after he had risen, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons, and she went and reported to those who had been with him as they were mourning and weeping. Yet when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe it. I think that is understandable, isn't it? So he appears to Mary Magdalene, and she goes and tells the others, and they didn't believe it. You're crazy. Well, we know Peter and John run to the tomb themselves to verify what's going on. But they didn't believe it because who would? This is unbelievable in the sense of it is outside of the realm of anybody's experience ever. And after this, he appeared in a different form to 2 of them walking on their way into the country. These are the men. These 2 are the men on the road to Emmaus. And they went and reported it to the rest, who did not believe them either. Didn't believe them either. You're crazy, right? Later, he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were reclining at the table. He rebuked their unbelief and hardness of heart because they did not believe those who saw him after he had risen. So later, he appears to the 11. Multiple times, we know that Jesus appears to multiple different groups, multiple different times, in multiple different numbers, right? Different settings, different places. all of these things over and over and over again. And there is a rebuke to people that don't believe those who saw him. Listen, that rebuke is still in. If you don't believe the testimony of those who saw the risen Lord, you also will find yourself in danger. So we need to believe the reasonable testimonies. There are so many of them. There's so much more evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ than for almost any other historical event. And there are multiple people that testified about it. There are people that died for it, saying this happened, and they were threatened with death, and they died because of it. They gave their lives completely in service to the resurrected Christ because they believed in the resurrection. There are so many multiple ways that his death is true, as is his resurrection is true. It cannot be denied historically. So at that point, then you have to deal with, if it is historically true, what does that mean? What does that mean about who Jesus is if it is historically true? Because if he is risen, then he is God. And if he is God, then I have to deal with the words that he said. The things that he said and what he has done have to be addressed in my life and in yours. Everybody's going to have to answer for that. Hey, I hope that's helped. I appreciate you watching. Man, we start Genesis next week and explore the Bible. So if you're continuing, we'll have Genesis up next week. Subscribe, like, comment, share with others. We'll see you next week in the book of Genesis, chapter 1.